Many states do have some form of regulation. Even if they get an F, they have something in place. We just don't think that they check any of the boxes. Colorado's doesn't even have any regulations. So Colorado, 27% of their grid is wind, 9% of the grid is solar. So that's a substantial amount of the grid that's where they're relying on renewable energy. So states like that, we think that there needs to be regulations in place because it's a large industry there.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy here in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host Amy Cooke. And for this week's show, we have one of our favorite topics, quite frankly, sort of the ongoing battle over what to do with end-of-life energy projects. It comes up all the time in the context here in Colorado of oil and gas. We've brought it up in the context of renewables as the state has proceeded to go down that path. And so what we want to talk about today is a great recent study that actually digs into this and looks at both nationally, how do states stack up on this question, and how does Colorado stack up on this front? So I'll let you kick that off, Amy.
Yeah, I actually really love this study because not only does it talk about what states, and they're graded, we're all graded on what our decommissioning rules are for both wind and solar, but also on natural gas. Or natural gas and oil, I should say, not just natural gas, but oil and gas. And they also put a dollar figure on it. And that's important to know as well. We always rely on the Lewis Roca study. This one goes much further, dives much deeper into it. And we actually have one of the authors on. I love the way they introduce their study. Who pays when wind turbines and solar panels wear out? A hidden liability. With us is Curtis Schube, and Curtis is the executive director of the Council to Modernize Governance. Curtis, welcome to the show. Welcome to PowerGab. We're thrilled to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, can you tell us about what was the genesis of this study? And then we want to get in. We'll start big, or we'll start national, and then go smaller.
Yeah, so it actually started with a different paper. We did a paper over what the renewable waste crisis. I mean, I'm sure if you talked about this, you're familiar with what that is. But at the end of the useful life of any energy facility, whether it be wind or oil or anything else, there has to be a process called decommissioning that these sites go through. So they have to restore the site to a usable condition. And so we noticed that there's a lot that goes into decommissioning both wind facilities and solar facilities. But there isn't necessarily, that we noticed, a lot of regulation around the financial assurance, which is the money that goes into paying for that process. So after writing that paper, we were thinking, well, maybe we should compare this to other industries to see how it stacks up. And so that's how we ended up with this paper.
And Curtis, you worked with Mark Mills's group, correct?
Yes, with the National Center for Energy Analytics.
Okay, so let's talk about just what you found. We know that for instance, in Colorado, that there is a lot of regulation around the decommissioning of oil and gas, but there is no regulation around the decommissioning of wind and solar. And as we said, that's been a problem. But let's talk about what you found nationally. Overall, what does the picture look like?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. History repeats itself. Everybody's familiar with this concept of like an orphaned oil well. We've all heard that term. And that was back. Ran into the same problem decades ago. They didn't have these regulations in place for the oil industry, and when they were done, they just left them. So we're trying to prevent that from happening with the new industry of renewable energy. So we found we tried to do a side-by-side comparison from each state and also the feds. Between renewable energy and oil and gas. And we boiled it down into a grade. And we actually did this from as objective as we could. So we gave it 5 factors that we were looking for when reviewing the regulations. So we wanted to see mandatory language, meaning they shall put the financial assurance in place rather than may, that it's in a fixed number rather than a discretionary number, that it's a number that's of a sufficient amount, we want the form of financial assurance to be guaranteed. So we don't want like a revocable trust, for example, like that the money may go away. And then we also want to see that money in place before the begins its inception. So in doing that, we looked at each reg from oil and gas and renewables, and as a result, if we were to give this to a GPA, like so everything's given an A, B, C, or D, or F. The GPA for renewable energy is a 1.18. The GPA for oil and gas is a 3.4, meaning renewable energy, 30 states had a failing grade with only one A. Oil and gas had 28 A's and only one failing grade. So we see kind of an inverse relationship there. Oil and gas is very well regulated and renewable energy is not.
What is the A state for renewable energy? And what is
Virginia.
okay, Virginia. And how about A states for oil and gas?
Well, Colorado's one of them. There's many of them. There's 26 of them. I think there was 40 states that have oil and gas industries right now. So, well over half of them have an A.
I'm just curious about what gives Virginia an A. We don't have to get too far into the minutia, but is it a similar paradigm that you see with A states in oil and gas, that they apply just sort of the same thing to renewable projects, or is there a unique system that they apply to renewables?
For our purposes, it was just purely a checklist. So in this case, they checked all five of those factors. So the way we would do it is if one factor is missing, they get a B. If two factors are missing, they get a C. We wanted to do it very objectively. We didn't want to have any bias in here. So we even did it all separately, and before we even tabulated the GPAs, it kind of just worked out the way we assumed it might. But we wanted to do it very objectively, and so yeah, it was very just did check each box. In Colorado's example, though, it was one of the rare exceptions. They actually didn't have all the boxes checked, but they were so careful to describe all the different various possible things that could happen that we gave it an A anyway, because we felt that they were making a great effort to make sure that the financial assurance would be in place. This is for oil and gas.
Yeah, and that makes sense because that's something we've talked about, the really ramping up attention on orphan wells here in Colorado. And they've, especially in the last couple of years, have attached a lot of financial assurances and the like. So that makes some sense to me. You also attach a dollar amount to each of these graded states. Where does that dollar amount come from in terms of this liability?
Yeah, which we try to create a ratio from what the potential liability would be to how much is in place.
Gotcha.
Like how much financial assurance the regs require.
Gotcha.
What's the total amount for the United States? What's that dollar amount? What is the liability?
Well, so I'll have to say, to preface it, it's still very theory based right now because a lot of these sites haven't hit their end of life, so we don't have a true number. But the estimate is roughly 50 billion in liability as it stands right now. That number could be growing because these sites are being put up all the time.
Right. So $50 billion in essentially liability for decommissioning. These are not guaranteed. Somebody's going to have to pay for the end of life on these facilities.
Correct.
And then
each state has a different cost involved. So that some states, they might have to ship it hundreds of miles away, and others might have something local. So there's different calculuses that go into what costs would be for each state.
Okay, so let's get into Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
Colorado got an F. So why did Colorado? Did it check any box
on the renewables? So many states do have some form of regulation. Even if they get an F, they have something in place. We just don't think that they check any of the boxes. Colorado's doesn't even have any regulations. So they leave it to each county to kind of figure it out on their own. And so when we looked at some of the individual counties to see, what they were doing, they were kind of all over the map. So there was plenty of examples where they'd allow late filings, meaning after the site had already begun construction. There was unreliable forms of assurance that they were accepting. So in these types of states, the reason why we would give them an F is we think, so Colorado, 27% of their grid is wind, 9% of the grid is solar. So that's a substantial amount of the grid that's where they're relying on renewable energy. So states like that, we think that there needs to be regulations in place because it's a large industry there.
So if it's left up to the county, you said the unreliable assurances. What does that mean? What if you're in a county, what would be considered a reliable assurance versus an unreliable? Let's say you're somebody who maybe it's a neighbor, or maybe it's somebody that their land borders yours. They are looking to put up a solar installation, and they want to check to make sure that there is the proper decommissioning regulations that are in place. What kind of assurances, what should they be looking for?
Yeah, so to be clear, we're talking about industry type sites. Not so
Yeah,
we're not
right.
talking about somebody's putting a solar panel in the
No,
backyard. But
this would be utility scale.
yeah, I just wanted to clarify
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
So when we're talking about reliable versus unreliable, like a bond, for example, that's guaranteed by a bank. So when a bond is purchased, they know if that bond is called upon, the bank has the money there for them. But something like a revocable trust where they can draw upon the money, that would be unreliable from our perspective, because if they can draw upon it, then maybe when it's needed, the money's no longer there. That's actually something we found on a different study with nuclear energy, that these companies are able to invest the money. And a few years ago there was some volatility in the market, and they actually lost money, and then there was a risk of them not having the proper financial assurance there. So that's something that's important for us to look at it for any energy site. We need to make sure that the money can't go away.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I know you mentioned as an assurance also for instance, the company that owns the installation potentially going out of business, and suddenly there's no one there to pick up the tab at the end of life. We've talked about that being a real problem here in Colorado, especially with the early wind turbine installations out on the Eastern Plains. There are several that are just standing up right now, and the landowners don't know what to do because these companies have come up and then ceased to exist, and suddenly no one claims ownership over the site out there.
Right. We're actually
Yeah, and that's exactly the type of problem we were asking regulators to prevent in the future.
So what other states are like Colorado? Are there any other states that are equally as lenient on assurances for decommissioning of wind and solar?
There are 30 fails, and I have struggled to remember exactly which ones had that exact. There were a couple that had a similar problem where it wasn't regulated statewide, but I'm sorry, I don't recall which ones those were.
Yeah, no worries. Well, of course, just for listeners' edification, we'll drop this report in the show notes so folks can dig into the methodology and dig into the report card, because it does put it up, puts it up nicely. I'm just curious, maybe this might be a little opinionated on your end, but what do you attribute the widespread F? And do you think that's intentional on behalf of policymakers looking to maybe put their thumb on the scale? Like, a lot of these states have A's for oil and gas, but F's for renewables. Is that them intentionally putting up financial impediments on one project versus another? Or is it just simply this is a new type of industry and we just haven't really gotten to the regulatory scheme yet?
I can't put myself in the mind of these regulators, but if I had to guess, I think it's probably some of all the above.
Okay.
I think that renewable energy is in vogue, and so I think when you're putting demands like financial assurance on these companies who are already kind of relying on government subsidies to exist in the first place, it represents a barrier to them being able to make these projects work. So there's probably some motivation to not prevent wind and solar from happening at all. I think also, there's kind of just a let's rush into this attitude when it's 30 years out, or at least that's what they're projecting when they start these sites. They're thinking that these will last for 30 years and they can figure it out later. That's actually a separate problem. We're finding that some of these sites are wearing out, 18, 20, 22 years in. And so we're hitting this deadline, we're hitting this point of where it's a problem quicker than we realized.
Also, Colorado's been doing this a long time now.
Right.
There clearly should be something that on some sort of regulation or some sort of standard, especially when we're only a state of, almost 6 million people, and we're looking at, according to this, $803 million in decommissioning liability. That's
and growing as the state invests more and more
that's right.
in technology.
That's right.
Yeah.
Even more and more. I want to ask you, Curtis, was there anything about the report as you were doing this? And this is, the research was probably the part that took the longest and was, I mean, 50 states.
Yeah, I have to give you kudos for doing that.
I do too. Just trying to find the information. But was there anything when you were doing this that surprised you, or that really stuck out to you, or any state that sticks with you, whether it's right or wrong or good or bad? Was there something in there that you would, this is fascinating and I didn't know?
Well, I guess a couple of things. In general, I was surprised by how big the discrepancy was between the two industries. I suspected that there would be, but I mean, we're talking 30 fails versus one fail. I didn't expect it to be that drastic. And I guess if you were to count a state, I would mention Colorado. Like some of the ones that we gave an F grade, suggesting that they have a statewide regulation, they were looking at 5 or 7% of their grid. But Colorado's, I mean, it's a pretty big chunk of their grid is relying on renewable energy, and for them not to have anything at all was pretty surprising.
And the fact that they're looking to go to 100% renewable. Right now, it's by 2050 is what's in statute, but the understanding is, I would say, a poorly kept secret is that a bill will be introduced to increase that, or to move those goalposts from 2050 to 2040. 100% wind, solar, and batteries by 2040. So we're going to see a lot more of it.
Yeah, and I certainly haven't seen much effort on behalf of state policymakers to come up with a state regime. We've talked about this for years now, and nope. They've been more than willing to talk about siting, statewide siting, but not much in the way of decommissioning. Curtis, I want to be respectful of your time because I know you have a hard out today, so I'll let you have the last word. If you have anything else you want to say about the study, or if you want to plug anything, go ahead and do it now.
Well, I mean, I would like just to suggest that any regulators who are listening to this, there are states that have done this right, or at least close to right. And so, in a state like Colorado, who has nothing, there are templates out there for them to look at. And so we would recommend that they look at and draft some legislation to get this problem taken care of.
Absolutely. Amy, do you have any takeaways for our listeners from today's episode?
That one is that we're really good at regulating oil and gas. That would be one. Number two is that we're really bad at regulating, I would say, even putting a little bit of standardization around wind, solar, and batteries when it comes to decommissioning. It's as if that hasn't even entered the mind or even the lexicon at this point of the state legislature. So that is just readily apparent, and I'm glad to see that. And I would say the last thing is, because we're clearly marching to 100% wind, solar, and batteries, firm your own grid, because right now the state isn't going to do it for you. But when you do, make sure you have your own decommissioning plan, because they're not going to do that for you either.
I like the twist on the evergreen advice. But that does it for us on another episode here of PowerGab. If folks like what they saw, they can head over to powergab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio shows, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you'd like to reach out to us to suggest future show topics or guests you'd like to see us interview, you can send that our way at info@powergab.org. We always love hearing from you guys. But until next week, we'll see you.